After the servo motors were delivered, I temporarily connected each driver and motor together to make sure each of them was working. I'll explain how I did this in the next video. The first step is to clean everything. The parts will often have a layer of oil which makes handling messy. I use gloves most of the time. In addition, you must clean inside the machined hollow shafts. The shafts I had were not only very dirty, but also had swarf from the cutting and machining. You don't want this in your bearings. I ended up using a kitchen brush with a rag on a cut steel clothes hanger. Using the long hex screwdriver extensions and one of the hollow shafts as a lever, putting on the M8 thread inserts was easy. I didn't use the battery drill because I wanted to feel how things were progressing. At this point, I put the ball nut assembly together. I tried 3D printing some grease nipples, but they didn't work because the grease gun wouldn't grip onto them and make a seal. This resulted in grease squeezing out everywhere rather than going into the bearing. So I went to an auto shop and got these. Once I'd screwed them in, I didn't remove them. To avoid grease going everywhere, I didn't use the grease gun until I was about to close the whole assembly. I will get to that point in a few moments. When I put on the locking nut for the top bearing, I used a small amount of Loctite to ensure it didn't unscrew. The shaft had to be very clean for the Loctite to work. I now turned to the bottom assembly. I loosely screwed the linear bearing to the 3D mount and loosely screwed that onto the extrusion. I wrapped a couple of turns of painter's masking tape around the hollow shaft and pushed it onto the slider. It was a tight fit. I used a ruler to measure that I had pushed it in all the way. With a bit of effort, I could now push onto the shaft to make the ball screw move up the lead screw without turning the slider by hand. I temporarily put the assembly together minus the motor to make sure the slider was going to move inside the extrusion without too much friction. I now started to grease everything up, including the linear bearing, the slider, the lead screw and the ball nut bearings via the grease nipple. I used quite a lot of grease at this point. I used the battery drill with the clutch setting on minimum to test move the shaft in and out. I tightened all the bottom assembly bolts after I tested that this was working. With the bottom assembly now finished and the ball screw mounted to the slider, it was time to mount the servo motor. I removed the key from the motor shaft using an M3 screw. Next, I thoroughly cleaned the shaft and put on some Loctite, then pushed the coupling onto the ball screw shaft. Note that I had to use a screwdriver to separate the two halves of the coupling initially. You will find out why I had to do this in a few moments. The bottom of the coupling was a little below the fixed bearing mount top surface. I had to leave enough room to tighten the coupling grub screw. I turned the motor shaft so that the keyway was in the following position with respect to the coupling screws. If the keyway is not in this position, the clamp part may be damaged when you tighten it up. You might need to move the angle of the coupling on the top bearing side as well, because you need to be able to get to the grub screw through the long slot on the motor mount. Once I had everything in position, I put on the Loctite on the coupling inner surface and slid the motor and 3D mount onto the coupling and tightened the grub screw as much as I could through the slot. Now I separated the coupling at the red tooth. Now I could finish tightening the coupling on the motor shaft by removing the motor and the mount. So finally I bolted the motor and the mount back to the extrusion, and the actuator was complete and ready for testing. For more details and other photos, go to the Open SFX website. I had to buy the bolts in fairly large quantities to still be a reasonable price, and usually this quantity was about 50. I had to buy a 419 piece rubber O-ring kit just to get the 4 rings I needed. Now I wanted to make sure that the rings would fit, so I simply got the kit that was recommended by others. I did buy some WD-40 PTFE spray, but I didn't need to use it because I used the lithium grease everywhere. The lithium grease does not affect the 3D filament. I initially 3D printed the bottom linear bearing mount at 20%. During the initial test with the drill, I'd forgotten to set the drill clutch to something low, but instead it was set at the maximum drilling torque. When I tested the actuator with the drill, it forced the ball nut nearly out of the 3D mount, and I had to reprint all of the linear bearing mounts again, but this time at 70% fill. The 3D printer I was using didn't have access to the finer settings, so I couldn't run the calibration print and change the settings. This meant that the slider inside the main extrusion was slightly oversized and needed filing. It took a very long time. One of the lead screw shafts was very slightly oversized for the top bearing locking nut. I had to use a lot of patience and some emery paper to get the hardened steel shaft diameter down enough to slide the locking nut over it. Well, I hope you found that useful. I'll put all the links I referred to in the description. In the next video, I'll share with you the electronics and the software setup. Bye for now.